After my wife passed away, we had the inheritance meeting. My daughter-in-law smiled coldly and said, "Now that the old woman is gone, you'll put the company in my son's name and fend for yourself." I smiled back at her. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Because I already knew something she didn't. And when my lawyer walked into that room 20 minutes later, he opened a folder, looked her straight in the eye, and read a DNA test out loud in front of everyone. "My name is Walter Hutchins. I'm 67 years old. I built a machine tool company from a rented garage in Denver, Colorado, into a business that puts my name on steel gates and paychecks for 200 families. This is the story of the day my daughter-in-law tried to take everything in one single afternoon, and the folder that ended her plan before she ever saw it coming." The meeting was set for 10 in the morning, 6 days after we buried my wife, Margaret. The lawyer's office was on the 9th floor of a glass building on 16th Street, the kind of place with soft carpet and a view of the mountains nobody in that room was looking at. My son Ryan sat across from me in a suit that didn't fit him quite right anymore, his eyes red from a week of not sleeping. Next to him sat his wife Vanessa, dressed sharp, back straight, a black folder of her own already open on her lap like she'd rehearsed this. Our family lawyer, a steady man named Paul Grant, who had handled Hutchins' Precision Tools paperwork for almost 15 years, hadn't walked in yet. He was running a few minutes behind, finishing something down the hall. So it was just the three of us in that room, waiting, the air conditioning humming, a box of tissues nobody had touched, sitting untouched in the middle of the table. Vanessa didn't wait for Paul. She leaned forward, folded her hands, and looked at me the way you look at a chair you're planning to move out of a room. "Walter," she said, her voice calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. "Now that your wife is gone, I think it's time we talk honestly. The company should go into Tyler's name. Ryan can run it day to day, obviously, but it needs a clean structure going forward. And you," she paused just long enough to make sure I felt it, "you should think about slowing down. Maybe Arizona, somewhere warm. Fend for yourself a little, Walter. You've earned the rest." She smiled when she said it, cold even, practiced. Ryan said nothing. He just looked at his hands. And I smiled back at her, because I had been waiting 3 months for this exact moment. To understand why I smiled instead of shouting, you have to go back 40 years, to a rented garage on Federal Boulevard, with a leaking roof and one second-hand lathe I bought with money I didn't really have. I was 27 then, married 2 years to Margaret, working nights at a machine shop, and days trying to build my own. Margaret was the one who believed in it before I did. She kept the books at our kitchen table every single night, in pencil, because we couldn't afford mistakes we couldn't erase. She answered the phone for our first 3 customers because I didn't trust my own voice not to shake. When the bank turned me down twice for a loan to buy a second machine, it was Margaret who walked in with her grandmother's ring and sold it without telling me until the loan was already approved. That's the kind of woman she was. Quiet, steady, never asking for credit, never needing it. Over the decades, that garage became a building, then a second building, then Hutchins Precision Tools, a real company with a real name on the sign, supplying parts to companies most people have heard of. We raised one son, Ryan, in a house 3 blocks from the first shop, and we built something we thought would outlast us both. Margaret got sick 18 months ago. Slow at first, then not slow at all. Through all of it, through chemo and bad nights and worse mornings, she never once talked about the company or the money or what would happen after. She only ever asked one thing of me, near the end, in a voice barely above a whisper. She asked me to watch Ryan closely, not because she doubted our son, because something in her, some quiet instinct built over decades of reading people, told her to worry about the woman standing next to him. Ryan met Vanessa 9 years ago at a trade conference in Chicago, back when he was learning the business from the ground up, and I still had him working the floor 2 days a week so he'd understand what the company actually made before he ever tried to manage it. Vanessa worked in marketing for a competitor, sharp, well-spoken, the kind of woman who filled a room the second she walked into it. Margaret liked her at first. So did I. She was quick with numbers, quicker with charm, and she seemed genuinely proud of Ryan in a way that made him stand a little taller. They married 2 years later at a vineyard outside Boulder, and 9 months after that they had a son, Tyler, and Ryan cried holding him in the hospital hallway in a way I'd never seen him cry before. For years I told myself the small things didn't matter. The way Vanessa always steered conversations toward the company's numbers at dinner. The way she corrected Ryan in front of people, small corrections, nothing anyone would call cruel on its own. The way she started coming to company events without being asked, standing near the department heads, learning names, learning who reported to whom. Margaret noticed it faster than I did. She mentioned it once, folding laundry, almost offhand. "That girl isn't building a family, Walter. She's building a position." I told her she was being hard on Vanessa. Margaret just nodded slowly and let it go, the way she let a lot of things go over the years, filing them away instead of fighting about them, which I understand now was never her forgetting, it was her waiting. Looking back now, I can pick out a dozen small moments I brushed past without thinking twice. The way Vanessa would bring up other family businesses she'd read about, how ownership got split or lost when a founder waited too long to plan ahead, always framed as friendly advice, never as a demand. I took it as a smart woman thinking ahead for her husband's sake. Margaret took it as something else entirely, and she never said so out loud until much later, because she wanted to be fair to a young woman our son had chosen, wanted to give her every chance to prove the worry wrong before she ever treated it as fact. The year before Margaret got sick, Vanessa's involvement in the company shifted from casual to constant. She started sitting in on quarterly reviews, first as Ryan's guest, then simply because nobody told her not to. She learned our vendor contracts better than half our department heads. She befriended our head accountant, a soft-spoken woman named Diane who'd worked for me for 22 years, taking her to lunch twice a month, asking careful, friendly questions about how ownership transfers worked in family companies like ours. I found out about those lunches only after the fact, from Diane herself, who came to me looking uneasy one afternoon and said she thought I should know Vanessa had been asking very specific questions about succession structures and what happens to a company's shares if a founder becomes, in her words, incapacitated. At the time, I told myself she was just protecting her son's future, being thorough, nothing sinister in a daughter-in-law wanting security for her family. But Margaret didn't see it that way. Margaret started keeping a small notebook, the kind you'd use for grocery lists, and she filled it instead with dates and small observations. The time Vanessa asked our lawyer directly, without me in the room, whether a will could be contested. The time she suggested, gently, that Ryan and I should meet privately to talk about my retirement timeline, a meeting Ryan never actually brought up to me himself. Margaret showed me that notebook only once, 3 weeks before she passed, her hands too weak by then to hold a pen steady. "I'm not paranoid, Walter," she said. "I'm careful. There's a difference, and I need you to be careful too, after I'm gone." I remember sitting on the edge of that bed, holding her hand, telling her she was reading too much into ordinary ambition, that plenty of daughters-in-law asked practical questions about family businesses, without meaning anything sinister by it. She let me say my piece, the same patient way she'd let me finish a bad idea for 40 years, before gently steering me somewhere better. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the nightstand, and said one more thing I didn't fully understand until much later. "I'm not asking you to accuse her of anything, Walter. I'm asking you to remember this notebook exists, if the day ever comes where you need it." I said I would. The last real conversation Margaret and I had about all of it happened on a Tuesday afternoon in April, in the bedroom that had become her whole world by then, sunlight coming through the blinds and thin stripes across the blanket. She was tired that day, more tired than usual, but her mind was sharp, sharper than mine most days if I'm honest. She asked me to close the door, which she never did unless it mattered. Then she told me something that changed the entire shape of what came after. She said that 6 months earlier, before she got too sick to leave the house easily, she had run into an old friend from her book club at a restaurant downtown, a woman named Carol who used to work in the same building as Vanessa's old marketing firm. Carol mentioned, almost in passing, over coffee, that she'd heard rumors years back about Vanessa and a man named Marcus Doyle, a senior executive at that same firm, married himself at the time, a relationship that supposedly ended right around when Vanessa and Ryan got engaged. Margaret hadn't thought much of it then. Old gossip, she said, the kind that floats around every office. But something about the timing had stayed with her, quietly, the way things do when a mother's instinct won't let a detail go. She wasn't asking me to accuse anyone. She wasn't even asking me to believe it. She was asking me to be quiet, to watch, and if the moment ever came where Vanessa tried to move against our family with confidence she hadn't earned, to remember that confidence isn't the same thing as truth. Then she took my hand, told me she trusted me to protect Ryan even from the people closest to him, and asked me not to bring it up again unless it mattered. I never did, not until I had to. After Margaret passed, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I started paying real attention, the kind of attention Margaret had been quietly practicing the whole time I was busy running a company and telling myself everything at home was fine. I watched how Vanessa handled the funeral arrangements, taking charge of decisions that weren't hers to make, choosing the flowers, the seating, even correcting the pastor once on how he referred to our family structure during the service. I watched Ryan go quiet in his own house, deferring to her on things a grieving son should have had a say in himself. And one evening, 3 weeks after the funeral, Sitting alone in my study with Margaret's grocery list notebook open in front of me, I made a decision I'm not proud of, but don't regret. I called a private investigator, a retired detective named Sam Fisher, who'd done occasional work for the company over the years, background checks on new vendors, that kind of thing, and I asked him to quietly look into a name. Marcus Doyle. It took him 11 days to come back to me. Marcus Doyle, it turned out, still lived in Denver, still worked in the same industry, divorced now, and according to public records and a few careful conversations Sam had with old colleagues, he and Vanessa had in fact been involved years before her engagement to Ryan, a relationship that several people remembered ending abruptly and quietly, right around the time Vanessa started seriously dating my son. None of that proved anything on its own. People have pasts. But it was enough, combined with Margaret's notebook, combined with everything I'd started noticing since the funeral, to make me sit up straight in that chair and ask myself a question I'd never once let myself ask in 9 years. A question about my grandson Tyler. I want to be clear about something, because this part matters more than any of it. I love Tyler. I have loved that boy since the day Ryan called me from the hospital hallway, voice shaking with joy, telling me I was a grandfather. None of what I'm about to tell you changes the way I feel about that child, not one single bit. But love for a child and clarity about a scheme built around him are two very different things, and I needed both at once. I didn't act on suspicion alone. I'm not that kind of man, and Margaret raised our son better than that, and I owed it to Ryan not to blow up his life over gossip and a private investigator's guesswork. So I did the only thing that felt honest. I arranged, quietly, through Sam Fisher in a private lab in Colorado Springs that specializes in discreet, legally admissible paternity testing, to obtain a sample connected to Tyler through entirely legal means, a container he'd used at my house during a weekend visit. Nothing invasive, nothing that touched or hurt that little boy in any way. I paired it with something of my own, and later, carefully, quietly, something I was able to obtain from Ryan himself, without him even realizing what it was for. A coffee cup he'd left behind after a visit. The lab explained the whole process to me in plain terms, the same kind of testing used in family courts across the country, admissible, accurate, and completely private unless I chose to make it otherwise. It took 19 days. 19 days of running a company by day and sitting with a folded piece of paper in a locked drawer by night, not opening it, not looking, just waiting for the moment I'd know whether to open that drawer at all. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon in June, delivered to a private box at the lab itself. No email, no phone call, exactly the way I'd asked for it. I drove to Colorado Springs myself to pick it up, told the office I had a doctor's appointment, which wasn't technically a lie. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for almost 40 minutes before I opened the envelope, because once I read it, there was no unreading it, and I understood that whatever it said, my entire family was about to change shape. When I finally opened it, the report was written in the plain, clinical language these things always use, probability percentages, technical terms, a summary paragraph at the bottom that any person could understand in about 4 seconds. The probability of paternity between Ryan Hutchins and Tyler Hutchins was listed at 0. Not low, not inconclusive, excluded entirely, the way these tests can definitively exclude a match when there simply isn't one. I sat there in that parking lot for a long time after I read it, longer than I want to admit, watching people come and go from the building, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger yet, not right away. My first thought wasn't about the company. It wasn't even about Vanessa. My first thought was about Ryan, standing in that hospital hallway 9 years ago, crying, holding a son he believed with his whole heart was his. My second thought was about Margaret, and the quiet grocery list notebook she'd filled with careful little observations for over a year, never once raising her voice, never once accusing anyone, just watching, just waiting, just being careful the way she'd always been careful. I folded the paper, put it back in the envelope, and drove home in complete silence, already knowing exactly who I needed to call first. I called Paul Grant that same evening, sat in his office until almost 9 at night explaining everything. The notebook, Sam Fisher, Marcus Doyle, the lab results sitting in a locked drawer at my house. Paul had known Margaret for 15 years, had drafted her will himself, and I watched his face go still and careful the way lawyers get when something bigger than paperwork walks into the room. He asked me one question before anything else. What did I want to do with it? I told him the truth. I didn't know yet. I wasn't interested in destroying Ryan's family over something Vanessa had done 9 years earlier, something that might have already been buried and forgotten if she'd simply stayed honest going forward. What I was interested in was making sure nobody used a lie to take a company Margaret and I had built with our hands, our sweat, and her grandmother's ring. Paul suggested we wait, quietly, and see what Vanessa actually tried to do once the funeral was behind us and the will was read. If she moved carefully, respectfully, we'd never need to open that envelope at all. If she moved the way he suspected she might, given everything he'd observed about her over the years working alongside our family, then we'd be ready. Margaret's funeral happened 8 days later, and I watched Vanessa throughout it with a clarity I hadn't had access to before, noticing the way she managed the room instead of grieving in it, the way she pulled Ryan aside twice during the reception to talk quietly about scheduling the will reading as soon as possible, the way she looked, more than once, like a woman checking items off a list rather than a woman who'd lost a mother-in-law of 9 years. By the time the inheritance meeting was scheduled, Paul and I both knew exactly what kind of meeting it was going to be, which brings us back to that room on the 9th floor, 6 days after the funeral, Vanessa leaning forward with her black folder and her calm, rehearsed voice, telling me to put the company in my 9-year-old grandson's name and fend for myself somewhere warm. I let her finish completely. I didn't interrupt her once. I watched Ryan's face the entire time she spoke, watched him stay quiet, watched the particular kind of quiet that comes from a man who has learned, slowly, over years, that arguing with his wife in front of his father costs more than it's worth. When Vanessa finished, she sat back, satisfied, clearly expecting either an argument or a slow, sad surrender from a grieving old man who just lost his wife and didn't have the fight left in him. Instead, I smiled. Just a small smile, calm, the kind of smile Margaret used to give me right before she proved she'd been 3 steps ahead of a problem the whole time. "Vanessa," I said, "I appreciate you being direct. I really do. Before we go any further, though, I think we should wait for Paul. He should hear this conversation firsthand, don't you think, given what he's about to walk in with?" Something flickered across her face, small, almost nothing, gone as fast as it appeared. Ryan looked up at me for the first time since we'd sat down, and right on schedule, 3 minutes later, there was a knock on the glass door, and Paul Grant walked in carrying a slim folder under his arm, nodded once to me, once to Ryan, and finally, for a long, deliberate second, to Vanessa. Nobody in that room but Paul and me knew what was inside the folder under his arm, and I could feel Vanessa recalculating, trying to read his face the way she'd read every room she'd walked into, looking for an angle. For the first time since I'd known her, I watched her come up empty. Ryan glanced between the 3 of us, sensing something had shifted that he couldn't quite name. Vanessa reached for her water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. I sat back, folded my hands the same way Margaret used to when she already knew how a conversation was going to end, and waited for Paul to begin. Paul sat down at the head of the table without any small talk, which wasn't like him at all, and that alone told Ryan something was different about this meeting before a single word was said. He opened his own folder first, the official one, the will, and walked through it plainly. Margaret had left her personal savings in the house on Larkspur Lane to Ryan outright, no conditions attached. The company itself, Hutchins Precision Tools, remained fully in my name as founder and majority owner, exactly as it had been for 40 years, with a clear, documented succession plan naming Ryan as future president once certain leadership benchmarks were met. Benchmarks Margaret and I had written together 2 years earlier with Paul's help, long before she got sick. There was no clause anywhere naming Tyler. There never had been. Vanessa's face tightened as Paul read through it, her rehearsed calm cracking at the edges for the first time that morning. "That's not what we discussed," she said, cutting in before Paul had even finished the paragraph. "Ryan and I talked about restructuring things for Tyler's future. Walter agreed the company should move toward the next generation." Paul looked at her for a moment, unhurried, the way a man looks at someone before he says something he knows will change the entire room. "I understand that's the conversation you believed was happening," he said, "but before we discuss any restructuring around Tyler specifically, there's something else I need to put on the record today, at Walter's direction, given the nature of what's being proposed." He opened the second folder, the slim one he'd carried in under his arm. Ryan sat forward slightly, confused, glancing between his wife and his father. Vanessa's hands, folded neatly on the table until that exact moment, went still in a way that wasn't stillness at all. Paul didn't raise his voice. He never does. He simply read the summary paragraph out loud, plainly, the same clinical language I'd read alone in my truck weeks earlier in that parking lot in Colorado Springs. A paternity analysis, conducted through an accredited laboratory, comparing genetic material connected to Ryan Hutchins and to Tyler Hutchins. Probability of biological paternity, excluded, 0% match. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your chest. Ryan's face didn't move for a long moment, like his mind hadn't caught up to what his ears had just heard. Then he turned, slowly, and looked at Vanessa, and I watched 9 years of small doubts he'd never let himself examine rearrange themselves behind his eyes in real time. That's not, Vanessa started, her voice cracking on the second word, all the practiced calm gone completely. That's not real, that's not. Where did you even. You can't just. Paul set the folder down gently. It's a legally obtained, legally admissible test, Vanessa. I'd be happy to walk you through the chain of custody in detail if you'd like, along with the laboratory certification. Ryan hadn't said a single word yet. He was still looking at her, not with rage, not yet. Something quieter and worse than rage, the specific look of a man doing math on his entire life in real time. 9 years, he finally said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. Marcus, Vanessa whispered, and the second she said the name out loud, in front of all of us, she understood exactly what she'd just confirmed with her own mouth. Her hand went to her mouth, too late to pull the word back, and for the first time in 9 years, every ounce of composure left her body at once. Ryan didn't shout at her. He didn't stand up. He simply sat there, very still, staring at a woman he'd shared a bed with for 9 years like he was seeing a stranger sit down in her chair. Paul quietly closed the folder and slid it toward the center of the table, and nobody moved to touch it. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the air conditioning humming again, except now it sounded like the only honest thing left in that room. Everything after that happened slower than you'd expect, and quieter too. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just the particular exhaustion of people watching a decade of assumptions collapse at once. Ryan asked for a break, walked out onto the small balcony off Paul's office, and stood there alone for almost 20 minutes looking at the mountains, while the rest of us sat in silence inside. When he came back in, his face had changed, settled into something older and steadier, the way a man looks after he's finally stopped bracing for a blow he didn't know was coming his whole marriage. He told Vanessa, calmly, that he needed time, real time, away from the house, and that whatever happened with their marriage going forward, it would happen through lawyers, not through another conversation at a family meeting about who deserved what. Vanessa tried, briefly, to reframe things, to suggest that biology didn't change 9 years of being a father, which was true, and which none of us disagreed with regarding Tyler himself. That boy hadn't done anything wrong, and never would carry any blame for this. But Ryan was talking about her, not about his son, and she seemed to understand, slowly, that the two things could no longer be separated in his mind the way they used to be. In the following months, Ryan filed for divorce, retained full involvement in Tyler's life regardless of biology because he made clear, immediately and firmly, that being a father was never only about a lab result to him, a decision that made me prouder of my son than almost anything else in his entire life. Vanessa's attempt to restructure company ownership evaporated the moment the meeting ended, and with it, quietly, any influence she'd spent 9 years building inside Hutchins Precision Tools. It's been 8 months now since that morning on the 9th floor. Ryan runs 2 departments at the company today, steadier than I've ever seen him, and we've started rebuilding the succession plan Margaret and I first wrote together, this time with Ryan sitting across the table as a full partner in the conversation, instead of a name mentioned in someone else's plan. Tyler still comes to my house most weekends, and I still take him out to the shop floor sometimes on Saturdays, the same way I once took Ryan, teaching him what the machines do, letting him hold a wrench like it matters, because it does, because none of what happened was ever his fault, and a boy doesn't lose a grandfather over a test result. Vanessa moved to Arizona, actually, the same state she'd once suggested for me, which isn't lost on anyone in the family who thinks about it. I don't feel triumphant about any of this, not really. Mostly I feel grateful. For a wife who spent the last year of her life quietly protecting a family she wouldn't be around to watch grow up, filling a grocery list notebook with careful little truths instead of confronting a storm she was too tired to survive herself. I think about her nearly every day, at the shop, at the house on Larkspur Lane, in the quiet moments when Tyler asks me questions about machines his grandmother used to keep the books for by hand at our kitchen table. Margaret never once raised her voice about any of it, not to me, not to Vanessa, not to anyone. She just watched and waited and left me exactly what I needed to protect what we'd built. I run a company today with my son beside me, my grandson down the hall on Saturdays, and my wife's steady handwriting still sitting in a notebook in my desk drawer, the only inheritance that ever really mattered.